Number two is we need to talk about legacy. What do you want the first thing your kids think about after you're gone to be? Right? You don't want them, first of all, to think, man, I really wish mom or dad wouldn't have left me this mess. We don't want them to think, man, I really loved mom and dad, but how could they have done this to me and made me spend all this time and money to get their affairs in order? Couldn't they have just done it before they passed away? So we don't have to deal with this. Particularly when there's a grieving process going on, people aren't interested in going to the bank and going to see the lawyer necessarily. They want to grieve. They want to think about the happy memories. They don't want to have to think about, oh, I'm dreading this. I'm dreading having to deal with all this mess. We want to have the good times be the first thing they think about. We want the happy memories to be coming up first, right? We don't want a prolonged legal process to muddy that memory and that legacy.
You are listening to the Legacy Talk podcast hosted by James A. Jones,
attorney at law and founder of Sound Legacy Law, PLLC in Tacoma.
Attorney Jones is here to talk about how to best protect your family, assets, and wealth, pulling stories from his more than 20 years of helping families and business owners protect their assets, create their estate plans, preserve their wealth, and plan for the future. Nobody wants to think about estate planning, but life has a way of sneaking up on you, and at any moment, something unexpected could happen that will leave you regretting not having acted sooner. So join Attorney James A. Jones in the Legacy Talk podcast, and together learn how to plan for your future today and have peace of mind tomorrow.
Welcome to Legacy Talk. I'm your host, James Jones. I'm an estate planning attorney in Tacoma, Washington. I've been practicing over 20 years, and my main practice areas are estate planning, probate, and estate administration. On Legacy Talk, we discuss topics that surround families and estates. Estate planning is often a confusing and complicated topic, but my goal with this podcast is to make it understandable and accessible to those who need it. So if this is something that interests you, I'd appreciate it if you click the subscribe button and like this episode so that you can follow along as we break down the barriers of estate planning. I'm excited to get to today's topic. The topic today is the "it's not my problem" mindset, addressing the belief that posthumous estate matters don't concern you, so that you can know how to avoid this problem with regard to your estate plan. So on today's show, we're talking about the "it's not my problem" mindset, addressing the belief that posthumous estate matters don't concern you. So let's get right to it. I've been practicing for over 20 years as an attorney. I've met with thousands of clients about their estate plan. Today, the scenario is this one. Son or daughter comes to my office. They schedule a meeting with me. I need to get my mom or dad's estate planning figured out. That's the topic. I'm dreading what will happen if we don't get this addressed now. Mom or dad are usually not at this meeting. If they are, they're sitting there with their arms closed and crossed, not participating typically. I don't even know what we're doing here, they say. I don't have a lot of money. I don't need to worry about this. It's not my problem. That's one scenario, and we can usually help in that situation without much problem if the parent is willing to participate. Usually, if they come to the meeting, we can get them on board, show them the importance of dealing with things now. If they don't come to the meeting, the kids are left with a homework assignment. Can you get mom or dad on board? And those situations are much less successful. It's important that parents and children can talk about these issues. So, why do people think this way? And how do we get out of that mindset? The why, I'm thinking about the why, and I come up with a couple reasons why. Okay. These are the most common ones that come up in my practice. First is it's an old school thing, right? Parents don't talk to their kids about finances. They grew up in the Depression or thereafter. They might be from another country and they've immigrated to the United States, or that's just their mindset. That's what they learned from their parents. Their parents didn't talk to them about their estate planning. They're not talking to their kids about their estate planning. And so it's a mystery, right, for the kids. They don't know what's going on. They don't know if parents have anything. They don't know what assets they have. They know that they've got a house and they're living on some kind of retirement. They don't know if they have any other money saved. Is it a pension? So that's one reason. They just don't want to talk about it. That's not something that we do in our family. Another reason why that mindset is common, I think, is because there's the fear of the unknown. I don't want to talk about what it's like to be, what it's going to be like when I'm dead. It's uncomfortable. It's stressful. It's scary, right? They're fearing that unknown state, right? That they could be in and that their family will be in without them. So it's easy to push that stuff off, right? And we've talked about our last episode, actually, we talked about this fear of long-term thinking, or the art of long-term thinking, that we need to really get in that mindset and get out of this fear of the unknown. The third thing that comes up a lot of the time is estate planning's for rich people. My estate is simple. I don't need all that estate planning. It's too expensive. Also comes up in this situation. I think it's, if you go see a lawyer, you're going to be paying tons of money for an estate plan, a will or a trust or whatever. They don't even know, do we need a will or a trust? They might not even know what a trust is. It's too expensive, right? But in reality, in most cases, not doing something is way more expensive in the long run than doing something proactively. 99% of the time, it's way cheaper to put even the most simple plan in place rather than having nothing. So that's something to consider too, and people don't know that. And the fourth thing that comes up is that they just don't understand the issues, and that goes back to the cost thing, right? I think the lack of understanding of issues is just an education thing, right? They don't know what they don't know, right? I tell clients all the time that the reason that they need to hire an estate planning attorney is because I've yet to meet a client of mine that has the hobby of estate planning research. It's just not a hobby, right? It's not even my hobby. And I'm an attorney. It's my business. It's my profession. It's not my hobby, though. I'd rather do other things than research estate planning. That's why I charge people for it. If it were a hobby, I'd do it for free, probably. But that's just not something that people think about. And there's lots of resources out there. This podcast is one of them. I've got blog posts. I've got a book on estate planning, things to consider in estate planning in Washington in particular. But it's something that we're really trying to get people educated on because it's not as complicated and scary as they might think. And not doing it is much more complicated and scary than doing it. Okay. So, how do we overcome that mindset of it's not my problem? I'm not going to be here. I'm not going to deal with it, right? It's not my problem. So, how do we get by that mindset? And I think the first thing is we have to have open communication. We need to talk about it. We need to talk about these issues. This has come up a lot on my podcast. And if you follow along, you've seen clips maybe. Death is part of life. Life is part of death. Deal with it, right? It's a thing, right? I guess transhumanism may be coming. AI will help us live to be 150 years old. I don't know. But sometime we're not going to be around, and we're going to have to figure out what happens to our estate when we are not here, okay? We got to talk about it. We got to be open about it. We got to stop being afraid to talk about these issues. Number two is we need to talk about legacy. What do you want the first thing your kids think about after you're gone to be, right? You don't want them, first of all, to think, man, I really wish mom or dad wouldn't have left me this mess, We don't want them to think, man, I really loved mom and dad, but how could they have done this to me and made me spend all this time and money to get their affairs in order? Couldn't they have just done it before they passed away? So we don't have to deal with this, particularly when there's a grieving process going on. People aren't interested in going to the bank and going to see the lawyer necessarily. They want to grieve. They want to think about the happy memories. They don't want to have to think about, oh, I'm dreading this. I'm dreading having to deal with all this mess. We want to have the good times be the first thing they think about. We want the happy memories to be coming up first, right? We don't want a prolonged legal process to muddy that memory and that legacy. The third thing in overcoming this mindset is understanding that estate planning does not have to be complicated. In reality, when you're creating an estate plan, and we're going to do a separate episode on this, but there's only a few things that an estate planning attorney really needs to know in order to get a basic estate plan in place. I don't really need to know every last little thing, right? We don't need to document every last piece of jewelry that you have or what's in your garage, or, if you want to have at least a basic plan in place, there's only a few things that I need to know. And I think that can be a barrier to entry, right? thinking, oh, this is a long and complicated process. Let's break down that barrier, right? Let's actually figure out what the process is, right? It's not a particularly long or complicated process, like I said. And when you're finished, it's a relief, right? It's a positive thing in your life. And look for that episode coming up. But I'm going to do an episode that talks about what do we actually need to create our estate plan. We don't want it to be a complicated thing during life, just like we don't want to have a complicated mess when we're gone. And then the fourth thing I think is important to talk about, particularly if you're listening to this and you're a son or daughter or friend that has a friend or mom or dad that is in this mindset, right? It's not my problem. I'm not going to be here. These are some scenarios you probably want to address, right? Sometimes you got to talk about the dirty, right? Sometimes you've got to talk about worst case scenarios. Mom, if you aren't here, this is what's going to happen. If there's no estate plan, these are the things that we're going to have to be dealing with, okay? The first of all thing that comes up is probate. And I've done an episode before that talks about probate and why we should avoid it and some reasons that we do it. But in most cases, you don't want to do it. If you don't have to do it, you don't want to do it, right? If you do an effective estate plan, you shouldn't have to do a probate because you have to go through a long court process. You're jumping through all kinds of administrative hoops. Skip it if you can, right? It costs money. It costs way more money to do a probate than to do an estate plan at the general level, okay? Another thing to talk about is what happens if your parents have a taxable estate. If they have a house that has a lot of equity, if they've got retirement savings that they thought they'd spend, but they never end up spending, right? They might have estate taxes that they're dealing with. And without sheltering assets and sort of arranging things in a most beneficial way, those estate taxes could be, a big chunk of money. So that's the thing to talk about. Mom, what happens if I have to pay a bunch of estate taxes? In Washington state, just having to file the estate tax return is a burden that I wouldn't wish on anyone, just because of the process being so complicated. And then every one of those estate tax returns is going to get audited. And so you're filing and going through that whole process, and then you're going through an audit. So avoid it if you can. The other thing that could be a worst case scenario is what happens if you have children or grandchildren or children of a deceased child who may have special needs? What if they're on Social Security disability or if they're on Medicaid for insurance, medical insurance? What happens to them? That could really mess up their situation. It could kick them off benefits. It could really put them in a complicated situation. So that's something that has to be planned for. And the other thing that people don't think about, estate planning is for life and for death, okay? With an effective estate plan, you're going to have a document that's called a durable power of attorney. This document can manage financial things and it can manage medical things, right? Financial decisions like paying bills, dealing with banks, all those asset types of issues. And the medical side allows someone to deal with doctors and hospitals and authorized treatment and, care and all those things. What happens if you're incapacitated during life? Mom, what happens if your brain doesn't work anymore? What happens if you get dementia? What happens? Which is super common these days, right? And so a power of attorney and or a trust can be effective tools in preventing things like guardianships and conservatorships, which might be the worst thing in the world as far as things that I have to deal with as an estate planning attorney. If I have to deal with a guardianship or conservatorship for a client, 10 out of 10 times I'm going to say, if you don't have to do it, don't do it. Okay? Because if you think probate's bad, ask me about how guardianships and conservatorships are run. They're much more complicated. So avoid it. People need to understand that. We don't want to have to deal with that stuff, right? We want to have the happy memories. We want to have no resentment with regard to mom or dad's planning, right? So these are scenarios or situations probably that you'll want to talk about. If the perfect person that's listening to this episode is saying, well, my dad or mom is exactly like that. How do I deal with it? These are some of the ways to deal with it, okay? Talk about the bad stuff and talk about the good stuff, right? Be proactive. Don't beat them up about it, but they need to know the issues, right? They need to know. Mom, dad, let's deal with this thing, okay? So on each one of these episodes, I have a story, a real world example, because this stuff comes up all the time. And the reason I'm doing this episode today is because I had this come up this week, right? This is something that comes up all the time. So this week I met with a client, and her mom has died about 3 years ago, and her dad just died within the last month or two. And mom, when she died, had no planning in place. Okay, nothing, no will, nothing. And so before dad died, my client's running around trying to get things in order, trying to change bank accounts or get her name added to bank accounts, and he was dragging his feet, right? She was having him sign documents that she had made on her own, which is a whole other topic that we will discuss on this podcast. The bottom line is that's not recommended, okay? You're not going to get it right typically. So it's better to hire an attorney, and I'm biased, I know, but it's better to hire an attorney than try to find something online that you think might work. And so dad's got this same mindset during this whole process his last few weeks. It's not my problem. I'm not going to be here. That's an exact quote from my client that I had this week. It's not my problem. I won't be here. So she's running around. She's going to the banks, trying to get accounts transferred. What she did is she created a trust that she pulled offline to try to fund this trust. We've talked about funding a trust, or it doesn't work. We'll talk more about that. But if you don't fund a trust, it won't avoid probate. And so she couldn't get it funded. She couldn't get the banks to work with her because there were deficiencies on the trust. And banks are hard to deal with anyway. But there were deficiencies that were just difficult for her to overcome and overcome their standards. So they didn't get everything set up adequately to avoid probate. The house didn't get put into the trust, right? It didn't get done. And the reason why is because dad didn't participate. And the sad thing about this story is not that, okay, now we've got to do a probate and it's going to be a hassle. You know, the sad thing is that instead of spending time with her father during the end of his life, meaningful time, she's freaking out, right? She's worried about what's going to happen and dealing with the aftermath of a lack of planning. Then there's a lot of issues still to deal with. There's a lot of issues. So it's going to be somewhat complicated to get this case done. But if dad would have dealt with this when he could have, when he was in his, better state where he could help participate in this process, it would have been so much better. It's just not the way that you want to spend the last days of a loved one's life, right? Dealing with this junk. Okay. So all the scrambling that she didn't end up working, the homemade estate docs that she didn't have what she needed. The banks didn't cooperate, like we said. And now we're doing a probate. Okay. And it's going to end up costing her more than double what it would have cost to get it set up properly. And that's just the way it is. Certain cases are more money, right? Certain processes are more money because they're more complicated and they take more time. And that's just the way it is. And so if dad would have cooperated, like I said, this isn't going to be an issue. So don't wait, have that frank conversation with your mom and dad. Hey, don't put this all on us. Don't put this all on us kids. Let's talk about this now, right? And if you're the one listening to this that hasn't got your estate plan done, do it. Now you've got the time, right? Now you've got some information. You've got some mindset shifting information, maybe, to, hey, well, maybe I do need to think about this. Maybe it's not too complicated to go see James or another attorney. Doesn't matter who you go to, right? Just go to someone that can help you, okay? And so the bottom line is get it done. Deal with it. Swallow the bitter pill, right? It's just something that has to be dealt with to make life easier for you, maybe during your lifetime, to make life easier for your friends and family that might be dealing with this process when you're gone. So get it done, okay? That's the goal. Be proactive. Think about those things. If you're having trouble about thinking about long-term thinking, there's another episode that I just did on that. The first commandment of estate planning, the art of long-term thinking, right? We want to think about that. We want to think about who we are. We want to think about what we're leaving our family. Okay. So that's it for today's episode. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thanks for listening to this episode of Legacy Talk. If you liked today's episode and you'd like to learn more, please like and subscribe for more great content. I've been your host, James Jones. To your legacy.
Thank you for listening to the Legacy Talk podcast by attorney James A. Jones. If you found today's episode helpful, we ask that you like and follow us on all major platforms so you don't miss out on the latest episode. If you have questions for Attorney Jones, reach out at info@joneslegacylaw.com or visit our website at joneslegacylaw.com. Join us again next week for another episode of the Legacy Talk podcast.